Good evening. You're listening live to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob, broadcasting to you, of course, as always, from the Extreme Studios in the Pinos Palace, just west of Orlando, Florida. I have the young 20-something Professor Pixel, as Winger would say, hanging out down incognito because he's nowhere to be found. He is AFK or something, Terminus El Dorado. I don't know what to call it, but he's not here. And this young 20-something was supposed to be giving me insight, and now I'm going to have to pull double duty on, of course, tonight's film, Twins of Evil, of course, the third and final film in the Karnstein Trilogy from Hammer Horror Productions, a Peter Cushing star-studded finale, if you will. And if the sharp ones would notice, I mentioned double duty as a unintentional joke there because, of course, Twins of Evil means the safe space code word that I had been using for two films now into this third of same-sex shenanigans from the softer side, and by that I don't mean Sears, of course, I mean lesbian and vampires, because let's be honest, who really doesn't love that? And here's why we love it so much. It's not because it's full-on blatant nudity or anything else. It's because there's a sensuality that women can emote from each other as they're seducing people, generally women in these first couple of films, although the last one they did seduce a man was seduced, I should say. And it's a different take on the vampire way of looking at it. Now, of course, these were based off of Sheridan Le Fanu or whatever how you pronounce it, books. And the first two films were pretty interesting. The first one was definitely pure hammer, very gorgeous to look at, sumptuous sets, a beautiful woman, the whole nine yards. We get Peter Cushing there. We get a great sub for the story. The second film was different, but it's cool because it takes place at a girls' school. And if you don't have a girls' school, you really don't have a great film. And so let's just be honest, it's a great setting for it to take place. You have some beautiful women there as well. I just think it's a nice way to do it. This one here to me is totally different than the first two, for better and for worse. It's a lot more violent in what I would say a more mean way. Even though I love a decapitation and burning at the stake, I mean, those are lovely things to do. But I think the themes that they deal with here really minimize the amount of eroticism in here and the potential that the first two films showed that you could do with lesbian vampires. And it's not a gimmick when you say lesbian vampires. It's the fact that you have a certain type of relationship between women that exist that you're going to show kind of seduction, friendship, loyalty, and the power of women. And if you want to talk about this being pro-feminist films, you very well could, because the men in the first two films, other than Peter Cushing's main character, for the most part inept. It takes them a lot of talking about what they're going to do before they end up doing anything, and the women really make everything happen in the films. But this third film is different. I think the problem with this third film, when I say problem, is this: is it's very ambitious. It takes on a lot of adult themes that I don't think really have a lot to do with the first two films. And because they've really toned down in the second film and now going to this third one, any of the sultriness and sexiness of the first two, despite them having Playboy playmates as twins in here, very gorgeous women, they turn it to more of a story about being, anti-Puritan, anti kind of religious kind of households. So there's nobody for you to really kind of root for. There's nobody for you to kind of go, okay, this is the main adventure. Like in the second one, that's kind of a Richard Burton-esque type character, Tom Jones looking kind of guy who's a writer, and you kind of at least see the world through his eyes. Here, you have Peter Cushing as a father who works for like the vampire hunting squad, and he's an asshole. And he's not a father that you want to be a part of. The movie does introduce some interesting things, like the twins that are his daughters come, and they're from Venice. So Venice is considered very progressive at the time. So they're probably not virgins. And of course, they show up in beautiful outfits, these gorgeous green dresses and hats, and their hair's done up nice. And of course, he blows a gasket because they're not supposed to be wearing that. And they're like, "Excuse me," and you're like, is this really how they're going to do it? Because they show him as a badass, decapitating, burning a witch at the stake, and you're like, okay, he's going to be one of these cool guys. But then you see the way he treats his wife, and it's like she's an object, and you're like, well, fuck it, I don't care about you, and I don't care about your wife. I don't care about it because you guys are miserable. You're making these two daughters miserable, and it's because they have such a miserable relationship with their parents, despite their privileged upbringing. Of course, one of the girls gets enchanted by the guy that's a part of the Karnstein family in the castle, and the other one kind of doesn't. So it's that old classic good girl, bad girl thing. Who's going to go with what? And then there's a love triangle with the really nice guy who's like a teacher or whatever, and it's boring. it has really nothing to do with, again, eroticism and relationships and women being powerful. It has to do more with family dynamics, and like I say, in a very Puritan type household, and it's not the same as the other two films. It's just strikingly different when you see this. I have to admit I was very surprised because I had seen these films quite some years ago. To me, they kind of all ran together. But if you go to watch all three of them and take a look at them, you realize that no, there's definitely a different theme to it. And at first, in this third one, I was willing to give it a bit more time to kind of open up and see if it was going to sort of change or pivot a little bit. To me, it does not do that. This is a movie that just kind of says, no, we're going to turn it up to 11 on what we're trying to do here. And it's tough. Princesses and Gentlemen, away from Atlanta to Miami to visit home. Well, there you go. Um, Miami, what a nice place to go. Yeah, so Princess, I don't know what your take is on this film or if you've seen it, but I don't think it's a bad film. I think it's done well, but the tone of it is just not like the others. It's made in the same year as the last film, but it just feels like it's more modern times the way it's shot. I think it had a different director on it instead of Jimmy Sangster, it was someone else. Whatever it is about the looks, or if it wasn't quite on Hammer Studios, and maybe it was somewhere else, it just doesn't look like the other films. There's very little of a dreamlike quality to it, a gothic feel, as it were, with um, slow kind of moving things happening, a slower pace, the fog machines, all that kind of stuff. You don't really get that here. You get more of the angry mob being led by Peter Cushing looking for stuff. You get really dumb sort of group think sort of stuff that happens in these small towns sort of things. And so you're like, okay, well, maybe the ladies here, the twins, will give me a little bit more of an interesting progressive type of storyline. And they really kind of don't. Um, One thing that I think is pertinent to bring up, and so I just have to come out and describe it, is that one of the characters in here is an African American jack mute manservant, for lack of a better term, butler, if you want to call it that. I don't understand the need for this character to be in here. I understand when you think of a Dracula type character, you think of more of a Renfield type, somebody that helps you out in the real world sort of thing, you know, your bitch or your lackey or whatever you want to call it. Your familiar, as it were, somebody that might do it. Most of the time, Renfield's been played by pansies or the wuss ass character. I'd like to see a different take on that, actually, not like that Nick Cage crap from earlier in the year. But in here, I'm going. It's a little awkward watching it, I think. And like I say, it's just the feel of it. It's not a fun film. It is intense. It's not a talk fest. Peter Cushing, of course, comes across as very hardcore on screen. He's got an intensity about him, and he's not the biggest guy in the world. I still like that. It works for the role that he's doing. You could argue that this is probably his best of the two movies he's in, the first and the third, in terms of his acting ability, but that doesn't make it fun. Again, you don't have to like the characters in a movie, but at least if you understand them a little bit, you kind of can get it. And even though you can get them, I still go, well, you kind of root for these two young, innocent women that might not be so innocent in their coming of age and everything, too. And I suppose that's the point, but really watering down the themes of, you know, again, eroticism and stuff between them, it's a cop out. They really softened up after the first film, really. The second film still was tight enough where there's a lot of things going on and a lot more women. This film does not have that. And so again, I I'm just kind of shocked because I'm like, man, after the second one, I thought they might have had a good one in here to kind of do it. Because again, the whole Mercarla Carmela being reincarnated every so often, we've gotten a little bit of the backstory of the Karnstein family situation in the towns that they seem to feed on with people. So it's kind of cool in the second film to see when a guy goes to town and he's sitting outside the pub having his drink and they're talking to him about everything. You're getting some information. This third one here is one of these religious highbrow type things, you know, that it's, you know, all evil, this, that, or whatever. And it's like, okay, it's just not a fun film. Um, I do think again that they tried tackling some other themes that the other two didn't really have in it. And I think not keeping up with the same themes hurts it because you only watch this film because of the other two, in my opinion. Can you watch all three of these Karnstein films independently of each other? Yeah, you can. I think the second one obviously benefits from the first. I think the first one would be the one to watch out of all three of them if you could only pick one in terms of getting the story down and the whole idea of the female and female type themes. Obviously, it gets it. And I know that Hammer would always try to push the boundaries of what they could get away with in terms of eroticism and supposed gore and effects and all that. But again, this film just doesn't have the same kind of adventurous gothic type fun feel to it as the first two. So it succeeds in that being a bit more grim. Doesn't make it more fun. Doesn't make it better, not necessarily, but it's just a different film. I don't know how many more times I can really say it. It's just really, really, really tough. Um, Princess, you're saying that you didn't know if they didn't know where it wanted to go. Yeah, the love triangle was by far the weakest. At least in the second one, you had the idea of a guy getting seduced, probably out of a convention because it was needed at the time. But of course, you saw where in the second one where it was more of Carmela's more of a would you say it? Almost more of like a maternal type figure to her, but then gets intrigued by her and everything too. But then of course you've got the man that professes his love and he kind of simps out on her a little bit, I think. At least you had a kind of a interesting dynamic there. Um, yeah, it's just here's the thing. The original Bram Stoker's Dracula was probably 30, 40 years maybe after um, the Sheridan Le Fanu novel. I just think that some of the themes from that made its way into Dracula, but Dracula's what everybody knows, right? And of course, when people say Dracula, they usually, depending on their age, they might think of the Universal Dracula. A lot of them probably here in the United States don't even think of the Hammer horror films, but they'll think of, oh, the Gary Oldman Dracula, which kind of was a glamorous romp in a way. That's hit or miss for me, believe it or not. But they have an idea of what a vampire is. They just don't realize that actually it started off as more of a same sex kind of thing that had to do with, I don't know if you want to call it, that little sapphic thing from the old Greek stuff or whatever about self love and love of others, and not necessarily sexual, but the relationships you have and trying to break free from it without putting the religious spin on it, which this movie definitely does. I think the first two movies are kind of progressive that way, and certainly not this third one. But yeah, overall, I would say, and I would agree with you there, Princess, that it is the weakest of the three. Now, by no means it doesn't mean don't go see it. If you're a Hammer horror fan, you're going to end up seeing it. Absolutely true. And of course, there have been some other vampire movies that they're done over the years, not just that, that have lesbian vampires in or witchcraft or whatever. Obviously, I'm thinking of was it Franco from was it Italy or Spain? There's some different ones over there that we may try to cover. Um, there's definitely the Italian style versus the Spanish versus the British here. It'd be interesting if the young 20-something Professor Pixel can stomach how graphic some of these changes could be. There's even that one that is really kind of smutty. It's a film. There's a guy that did adult films back, I think, in the 60s and 70s. And so is it an exploitation type film? Yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of it here. It's nothing but vampires and occult kind of stuff. And is it kind of like what we're talking about? Sort of, yeah. Damn, what the hell's the name of it? It's from the 70s, and within 5 minutes, you've seen more nudity in this film than you've seen probably in all the films you've seen in the past 20 years put together. Seriously, it's just there. So definitely, you have people interpreting it their own way to make a fast buck, and of course, that one is just an excuse to see people nude and all that. Uh, it's, it's bugging me. I can't think of the name of the movie, but it's definitely a ripoff of this. The Lust for a Vampire. I'm thinking of. The tip's right on there on my tongue for what it is. If you're really into that kind of stuff, then yeah, that's what it would be. No, Lust is the one here in this trilogy. Whatever, we'll cover it, I'm sure, in our upcoming vampire films. Yeah, the thing with Hammer trying to make these things mainstream is a lot of times they made movies not necessarily as a single release, but they would do it as a double feature. So you might get something on there, and then you get a lower budget one just kind of tacked onto it. So a lot of your revenue would come from the ticket sales of the first movie, and you kind of split it a little bit. From what I understand, reading up on how films were done in Britain back in the day, specifically from Hammer, that's how it would be, because this is super, obviously a low budget film, but it does have all the hallmarks of a Hammer film. You're going to recognize gorgeous set pieces, the countryside a bit, beautiful women here. I can't stress enough that these women, I think, come across as very natural. I think they were a nice pick for it. Obviously, being 1971, 72, a lot of things that, in my mind, some of us forget about would be like, say, the Playboy Mansion. And since they were Playboy twins, the first ones ever, that's an interesting grab for Hammer Horror or whoever signed them to do this film, because they're just naturally stunning, beautiful women, and they're a little bit different looking than what we would say from the British ladies that we've gotten accustomed to. I do think, though, that despite their smaller career and all, that they were fine in the film, they were well suited for it. I do think that it would be interesting, but not necessarily relevant, to understand what Britons thought of Hugh Hefner and the Playboy lifestyle, which at least was presented then as being more for the upscale, connoisseur gentleman type scene or whatever, with the Playboy clubs and the mansion, of course, and all that, as opposed to what it kind of seemingly was presented and turned into in the 80s and 90s, and of course upon his death and everything too, with his age and the appearance of virility and everything else there too, that they worked really, really hard on. But back then in the 70s, I mean, it was the thing. So free love, and all that would make sense. So I just go, I guess it was the sign of the times with Hammer Films, that they decided, you know what, we're going to keep milking this for what we can, and we're going to put out a product that's not probably the best as the other films, but we don't care. It's going to be good enough. And that's hard for me to say, but unfortunately, Hammer was probably on the downhill side of their movie making career at this point in the 70s. All I have to say is if you've seen all the Dracula films like I have, which we may cover some of them at some point, I believe you got Christopher Lee as Dracula in the friggin' 1970s disco in London. Make of that what you will, but that's where we're going, from the countryside and castles and stuff that makes you feel like it's a gothic setup, to trying to modernize the horror. And I don't think that Hammer as a studio was very successful in doing that. And I think this film is one of the first ones to me that this really shows. Not to say that it's bad or it's not worth watching. It's not, I think, a throwaway film where people don't care about it, but it just stands apart as being completely different from the other two. As we talk more about Hammer films over the years coming up, we'll be definitely revisiting this theme here a little bit too. And hopefully we'll get the technical issues with Professor Pixel taken care of in time for us to talk more about some of these films, because these are some of his favorite too. Princess, I know you're like that as well. Yeah, Princess, there's yeah, it's when you go down that Hammer rabbit hole, you start asking yourselves questions in real time, like, wait a minute, are they into disco? Am I gonna see Austin Powers here? Come on, it's Christopher Lee, but like, it's Christopher Lee, So yeah, all I know is by the time I was a kid and saw Star Wars, and I already knew who Peter Cushing was, I was like, why is Peter Cushing kind of like a nobody in these films? He's always such a hard ass in the Hammer films, and I still think to this day that they didn't even tap his potential in the Star Wars films. But that's another conversation for a future time. All right, I'd like to thank Princess and T and everybody else showing up here in chat for, again, the third film in the Karnstein Trilogy here, Twins of Evil. Go check it out. It's on Tubi, I believe, and at least here stateside, that is where I saw it. We're going to be going live here in about 5 to 10 minutes, 7 p.m. Eastern time, for the 1982 movie Diner, which has a whole hell of a lot of people. Young, gorgeous, pre-plastic surgery Mickey Rourke, Steve Guttenberg, who was everywhere in the 80s. Of course, Kevin Bacon and a few other people that you will recognize in it too, young Ellen Barkin and a few others. And it's going to be an interesting movie to talk, because we're going to have one of our eldest fans on here who's been around since the beginning. Easy E, Eric Breen's going to hop on board, and I never know what he has to say, but once in a while when he wants to jump on, he does have something to say, and I'm curious to see about it, because he's of the older generation, and so it'll be interesting to kind of hear some of this back and forth about what was pertinent at the time. It's a movie set in the mid to late 50s about young men in their early to mid 20s and how they're trying to mature and deal with life, and that's really about it. But it really revolutionized the way a lot of movies would be looked at in terms of filming and characters and all that later on. At least that'll be my argument. So I expect to see you guys there and have a good time with it too. Be safe on your trip there, Princess. Everybody else there, have a good night, and always to remember to stay extreme. Good night.